This is Barçın Yinanç. I'm doing foreign policy talks for Panorama Portal. And in this episode, I am joined by retired Ambassador Fatih Ceylan. Mr. Ceylan is a career diplomat, and more than 20 years of his career were dedicated to NATO's issues. In fact, he was Turkey's envoy to NATO. I have to say that Turkish diplomats usually remain silent after retirement. Mr. Ceylan is not one of them. In fact, he's been very vocal in voicing his views on Turkey's foreign policy, on raising awareness about NATO issues. And he has been writing a lot of articles in Turkish and English. And most of them, they're not just assessment of the current situation, but they're also policy proposals, which in my eyes makes them even more invaluable. So I am thankful for Mr. Ceylan to join me today, and I'm going to go straight to discussing the implications of the recent NATO summit on Turkey and Turkey's foreign policy. Mr. Ceylan, now, as you have predicted ahead of the summit, the transatlantic family has underlined the political dimension of the organization. They have pledged to consolidate democracy, to increase the resilience of democracies. They've underlined the rule of law, but I have a bit of a difficulty to visualize how this will impact, for instance, Turkey directly and in concretely. How will this affect Turkey's relationship with the transatlantic alliance?
Thank you for that question. I've been writing on this particular issue for quite a long time, and I think it's important. And it was evident from the NATO 2030 report, United for a New Era, a very comprehensive report which charts the future course of NATO for the next decade and even beyond, that there was going to be a visible emphasis on protecting, upholding democracy. That is an inherent part of the Washington Treaty anyway. All NATO allies are bound by the founding treaty. And just at the very beginning of it, it's very clear that NATO members should stick to pluralistic democracy, individual liberties, and rule of law. And then the treaty continues and points to the importance of having strong institutions to strengthen democracy. So it has always been on the agenda of NATO anyway. But because of a rather wide perception that NATO is solely a collective defense organization, people, most of the time, ignore the political role that NATO plays. So NATO is indeed a political military alliance. And the reason, one of the reasons why the process was launched to prepare the NATO 2030 report was to make the political role of NATO stronger. So that was one of the driving motivations behind this comprehensive report. So those people, those colleagues who follow NATO events, including myself, were trying to drive home the importance of having a genuine democracy based on individual liberties and rule of law.
Mr. Ceylan, I hear you, but in contrast to European Union, for instance, where there is conditionality, where Turkey is not a member, how NATO can ask and sort of force or pressure its members to uphold the rule of law or democratic criteria? Does it have this, pressure tools?
We have to separate the EU and NATO in that respect, actually. NATO is not a supranational organization. The pressure, you can feel it from time to time. It depends on how your views and positions are welcome or not welcome in NATO. So the more space you have in having your views, having a widespread support, the more likely that you will be seen as a democratic country. And let us not forget, even in some NATO or NATO-related documents, 3 countries have been criticized in recent years due to the democratic deficit they have demonstrated. Now, such an open statement, of course, cannot be made in the formal structures within NATO. But beyond that formal structures, I mean, there are politicians, public opinion, analysts, think tanks, academia, and what have you. So our track record has not been very bright in recent years with respect to democracy, individual liberties, and rule of law. So that is a kind of indirect pressure being applied to, members of NATO. And 3 countries figured prominently in those analyses. That is Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. And I think this is still the case. So we cannot, none of us can ignore this external pressure coming to a particular allied country.
Okay, Mr. Ceylan, I think in a recent article, you've sort of categorized some countries like first league nations and third league nations. Maybe that's the kind of atmosphere that creates within NATO. The more you have democratic deficit, the more maybe your words carry a weight. That's what I gathered from your answer. But in Ankara, there could be this mentality that because Turkey is so important geostrategically, that its democratic deficit could be turned a blind eye by its allies. Actually, in this very recent episode, Turkey has volunteered to take control of the Kabul International Airport following NATO's forces' exit. So I could imagine that some ruling elites in Ankara might be thinking, we're assuming such an important responsibility geostrategically that, the democratic deficit and they would remain just on paper and as rhetoric. So would you see that there is such a risk that Ankara might not care so much about this importance that the transatlantic alliance have given again to democratic resilience and consolidation of democracies?
The more geostrategic importance you have means that you bear further responsibilities. So you cannot solely rely on your geostrategic importance, although I do not deny the fact that it does have a bearing on one country's position. So you have to carry out your national or otherwise duties in a responsible manner. Now, NATO, let me give a concrete example. Since 2014, when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea and started destabilizing the Donbas region of Ukraine, the emphasis was on a rules-based order. So NATO countries are obliged to stick to what they signed. That I'm talking about international law. So we cannot act like a lonely wolf. So let me put it in different terms. Those countries with geostrategic importance do carry further responsibilities based on prudent and well-calculated attitudes. All having a large army with a vast array of capabilities does mean something, but it doesn't mean everything. So these will have to be taken into account while formulating your national security policy. On Afghanistan, there are two views on that. Let's put it that way. One is that, okay, the United States together with NATO are withdrawing from Afghanistan, and a deadline was set for the 11th of September. And the Kabul International Airport is extremely important strategically for Afghanistan. And we have been there for quite a long number of years, deployed Turkish troops at that port. And we were the lead nation in the Kabul Central District. Coupled with that is the operation and maintenance, and certainly the protection of the Kabul International Airport. What is critical here is what kind of logistic support we will have. And this is directly related to the security of our forces over there. My personal view is that there must be clear-cut terms defining the scope of logistics support. That is extremely important if the decision to continue with the operation and maintenance plus the protection of the airport, if that duty will be taken forward by Turkey. But the other aspect that one has to take into consideration is the bilateral friendly relations extending to centuries between Turkey and Afghanistan. We always felt bound to help Afghanistan when it came under duress. That is the track record of Turkey-Afghanistan bilateral relationship.
Right. So in this point, I was just going to say that some segments in Turkish society are criticizing the government's decision to sort of first explore, right? I mean, it's being matured. It's not finalized, my understanding, but the Turkey's decision to volunteer taking control of the Afghanistan Kabil's airport. The critics of the government say that this is being done in order to mend fences with the United States and with the West Transatlantic Alliance, but that this is being done at the expense of risking the lives of soldiers.
I am well aware of these criticisms launched by different segments of our society. But there's another point that has to be underlined. It's a fact that the Turkish Grand National Assembly took the decision in January 2021 to extend the term of our forces deployed in Kabul for 18 months, which brings us to end of June 2022. That is one factor. Of course, what makes some of us suspicious is twofold. One, the proposal was made by the United States in the run-up to the NATO summit. And the second is the Taliban spokesperson said we are opposed to Turkish presence in Afghanistan, but under the umbrella of NATO. That's what he said. So the best way would be to get in touch with all those involved, be it in Afghanistan or the surrounding countries, particularly Pakistan, to try to reach to those opposing segments of Taliban to Turkish presence. But I continue to read Afghan and Pakistani outlets, news outlets, and it's not that negative. Let's put it that way. It's not as negative as we perceive it in Turkey.
I understand. So the message I get from you is that provided that there are certain guarantees taken, most probably from the Taliban and the Afghanistan government, and provided that NATO provides some logistical support, that Turkey should undertake this, not only in order to fulfill its obligations and commitments as a NATO ally, but also due to its own interests and cultural and historic relations with Afghanistan. Do I understand you clearly?
Exactly, that is very loud and clear. Let me also add that in addition to having a very clear set of criteria or guarantees geared towards protecting our forces over there, I think another option should be to seek to involve other nations embedded within that force. I'm talking about a multinational presence in Kabul.
In fact, President Erdogan said they were talking with the Hungarians, for instance, in order to include them, and in fact, even the Pakistanis. Your last two sentences on this issue, I want to go on with Russia.
This should not be seen as a kind of leverage to strengthen the role of Turkey within the alliance only. There should be another window introduced to it. I think we should merge these two approaches. I'm talking about, on the one side, okay, we have the NATO dimension. I agree with that, although NATO presence will terminate on 11 September this year. The second dimension is the Turkey-Afghanistan bilateral relationship. I'm sure, I have been to Afghanistan on several occasions. I'm sure that many segments in Afghanistan, including the Taliban, are not in principle opposed to Turkish presence in Kabul. That would be at loggerheads with the very friendly bilateral relationship between Turkey and Afghanistan. So I think we should have a broader view when we assess if the Turkish troops will remain in Afghanistan.
Oh, I have to unmute myself. In fact, I think it was important to underline the fact that the Turkish government had prolonged the presence of the Turkish armed forces in Afghanistan long before the decision taken by Biden.
It's the Grand National Assembly, of course, that was brought to the Grand National Assembly. That's a big difference.
In fact, that's right. Okay, thank you very much to point that out. Now, I want to talk about Russia. Obviously, this is going to be a challenge for NATO as well as Turkey, because Russia was defined as a strategic partner in the 2010 strategic concept paper, whereas in this summit, it was clearly stated as a threat for NATO, especially after what happened in 2014 following the Crimean decision taken by Russia. Now, Turkey has obviously complicated relationship with its northern neighbor. So in the year ahead, while there will be writing of the strategic concept, would you predict that there might be some frictions between Turkey and its transatlantic allies? That would you predict that maybe Turkey would rather soften the language against NATO? And in general, how do you think Turkey's relations with Russia would be affected following the summit conclusions?
Well, let's try to see events as they unfolded from the very beginning of this new year. I have noticed, at least I have noticed, that a softer tone has been used vis-a-vis Europe and the United States since the beginning of 2021. There could be a flurry of arguments for that, the details of which go beyond this interview, but that is the case. Let's remember the statements made by the president, the foreign minister, the defense minister, in the case of relations with the West at large. And I have read with great attention the statement made by the president after the NATO summit. That is a very interesting statement, which reminded me of past statements used in the past regarding Turkey's relations with the West. The president talks about that NATO should shoulder further responsibilities from the Black Sea, from the Mediterranean, to Asia, to Europe, in a very wide area. And he talks about the importance of democracy. It's a very clear-cut statement given there. With regard to Russia, I think one should not be mistaken by the rising Turkish-Russian relations in different fields. We have never seen eye to eye with Russia on the string of protracted conflicts that surround Turkey, starting from Transnistria, extending to Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Crimea was added to those. And in the case of Syria, for instance, in Idlib, recently, I would say, you see divergences between Turkey and Russia. But one way or another, based on a pragmatic approach, because both sides have vested interests in maintaining a certain level of relationship, the points of convergence are seen more on the agenda, on our menu. But one should be cautious on that, because you could argue whether divergences neutralize convergences or otherwise. So Russia is our neighbor. We will have to maintain good neighborly relations with Russia. That has been one of the resilient aspects of Turkish-Russian relationship since the beginning of the Republic. But that doesn't mean that should be taken to the strategic level. The S-400 issue is a different aspect, of course.
Yes, I was going to ask that in a minute. If you wrap up your answer.
Yeah. What I would say is that not only people who follow Turkish-Russian relations in Turkey are aware of the fact that this does not have a strategic nature. The same view is also shared by many in the West, in the United States and also in Europe. But of course, you could talk about whether Turkey was pushed by Europe and the United States further to Russia. Well, that's a controversial issue which needs further elaboration. But from our side, this counter argument is being launched, saying that Turkey is kind of sidelined by our allies. So we have to do something about it. Well, of course, the choice was a rather wrong area. That's the purchase of S-400 missiles. Exactly. That's my personal opinion, of course.
Exactly. I was going to say that. In fact, during the most recent Ukrainian crisis, I think Turkey's position, Turkey's sales of military equipment to Ukraine, its support, military support, but political support to Ukraine should have reminded the transatlantic alliance how complicated Turkey's relations are with Russia, and that it can attract the ire of Russia. In fact, very recently, I was very surprised when a Russian foreign ministry spokesperson talked about Turkey's ethical, ethnical, religious, linguistic differences, and that she said that Russia would have to talk about these if Turkey were to continue its position on Crimea. And there was no answer at all from Ankara to that statement. But having said that, as you have alluded, Turkey's decision to purchase S-400s sort of puts Turkey on spot, and the whole world thinks that, Turkey is, drifting away from the alliance.
Now, first on Ukraine, Turkey has been very adamant on supporting Ukrainian integration with the Western institutions, including NATO and the EU. That also includes Georgia, by the way. I mean, I remember on my active duty, and before that, when I was in Ankara, also in charge of Turkey-Ukraine, Turkey-Russia relations, this position of Turkey has been very clear since the very beginning, by the way. When it comes to the S-400 issue and the acute...
Can I just ask, actually, what is your expectation, looking to especially what has come out of Biden-Erdogan's meeting? What is your sentiment? What is your sense?
I think the deal was to allow both leaders to be in a position to say something positive to their publics, thereby kind of deferring the controversial issues and creating a breathing space for both to elaborate these rather complex issues, compounding the relationship between Turkey and the United States. So they came up in a positive spirit, talking about the kind of the robust relationship between Turkey and the United States, that Turkey is it's a strong NATO ally, and not getting into the minefields, like in the case of S-400s or support by the United States to PYD-YPG in northeastern Syria, and some other issues that have remained on the agenda of both countries. So that is what I felt. It was, I'm sure that it was well prepared before that bilateral meeting. And there was a kind of maybe tacit agreement between the two leaders not to get into those controversial issues, but rather give a positive image.
I hear you. In fact, I think when Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, said that dialogue on S-400 would continue, I sort of took this as a slight change in U.S. position, because until now, you know, the statements coming from Washington was rather, you know, we said what we had to say. The decision is up to Turkey. The ball is in the court of Turkey. So they gave the impression that they were close to any kind of negotiation. So when I heard Sullivan say the dialogue would continue, I kind of thought there might be some slight change without obviously seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. But from there, I want to talk about very little, because our time is getting up, about China, something that in the Turkish public we do not speak so much. You would recall that NATO Secretary General said that NATO will not go to China, but that China has come to NATO's geography with its technology, infrastructure, etc. How do you see the implication of NATO summit conclusion on Turkish-Chinese relations? Because before flying to Brussels, President Erdogan came up with a statement saying that the swap deal between Turkey and China was upgraded, etc. Do you expect the China issue to be another point of friction, maybe with NATO or Turkey? Or do you think China is also a big adversary for Turkey, and that it should rely on NATO as well when it deals with China?
Well, let's have a look at the NATO 2030 report, which I mentioned earlier on. China is not described as a direct military threat to NATO, but a big challenge having impact on Euro-Atlantic security. And the reason why China is coming to NATO is primarily for two reasons. One, China is investing heavily in Europe, buying some critical infrastructure, telecommunications network like 5G, and you know that, I mean, and cyber, in the cyber domain, and in the artificial intelligence, for instance, robotics. China is well advanced, and it's heavily investing in its military infrastructure, including the space. But on the other hand, okay, these are the challenges that will have to be consulted upon among allies. That is certainly the case. And that was very clear in the NATO 2030 report. But it also presents opportunities. There's an opportunities aspect of China vis-a-vis the West. So there needs to be a kind of balance between the challenges that all face around the globe and the opportunities that all can benefit around the globe.
I hear you, but do you think Turkey perceives such a threat from China? Because in general, in Turkey, there is so much anti-Americanism, anti-NATO, anti-Europe. But, on China or Russia, especially China, is not so much on the agenda. That's why I'm wondering whether the way the alarm bells are ringing in Europe I don't sense that we have the same sentiment of intimidation from China, rightly or wrongly, or I might be wrong in this assessment.
I think we should not mix where you put your strategic axis and the transactional nature of your relations with a country like China. China is certainly a very important actor. Now we are seeing a kind of strategic competition between the United States, Russia, and China. It's become a kind of tripolar world based on multilateralism. After Biden came to the helm of the United States, of course, I'm not talking about the Trump period. So China is a challenge, not only for the West, but also for us in our immediate vicinity. But you have to make a choice. Will you be on the side of rising authoritarianism, or will you align yourself with the democratic group, with democracies? That's a big choice. And you cannot simply formulate and implement your foreign policy based on transactionalism. There must be a robust compass when you're formulating, shaping, and implementing your foreign and security policy. So China, in my opinion, although there have been, Turkey has been silent, not Turkey, I would say, but certain parts of Turkey have been silent on what China is doing, for instance, in Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang region. Okay, we do respect one China policy, but that should not allow China to suppress a certain segment of their own society. And they are doing that. That is for sure. There have been journalists who visited the Xinjiang region, and they had seen it with their own eyes.
Okay.
And we have descendants of Uyghur Turks in Turkey. They are also extremely eerie about what China is doing. So we cannot simply neglect it. But my conviction is that despite your economic commercial ties, by the way, we are on the losing side in economic and commercial terms with China. By taking that to the forefront and forget about the fundamental principles like democracy, like individual liberties, like human rights, like rule of law, is a dead end. So that is, I think, how it should be perceived in Turkey. And we must make a choice as a society.
I hear you.
Based on consensus, where our place is. Now, my view is that our place should always be on the part of democracy and the democratic clubs, of which we are member or aspire to become a member. Turkey made a choice in the past in those strategic terms, and it was the right decision. This is also misperceived in Turkey, unfortunately, thinking that, okay, we will do everything what our Western allies are asking. That's not the case. We are there to negotiate and defend our national and security interests. It should be seen like that. And let's not forget that there was this Cold War period where the margin for maneuver was rather restricted, not only for Turkey, but even for those countries which are much more developed economically than Turkey, like Germany. Okay, Germany is a different case, but like France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Spain, and countries like that. So the main issue here when you look at China or Russia or, or other countries, is to make the distinction. Where is your place in that global equation? So that is the main question mark that we should all respond clearly rather than stonewalling.
Yes, and no doubt, I guess the process ahead might indeed force the Turkish government and the Turkish society to take a clearer position, as you said, in this global competition and global dichotomy, pitting democracy.
Trichotomy, maybe.
Fact, yes. And indeed, NATO's importance in Turkey's foreign policy is not always well understood by the Turkish society. I'm expecting the fact that Turkey would be taking responsibility in Kabul International Airport could put back NATO issues back on the spotlights, which might be a good thing. So the more we discuss it, the better it is. Mr. Ceylan, thank you very much for sharing your views with me. Please continue to write your articles. I, as a journalist, take a great pleasure reading them. It's very insightful. Some of them are, in fact, published in Ankara Policy Center's website. I'm looking forward to have another round of interview with you when things again between Turkey and NATO gets more active. Thank you very much again for being with me.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. And for another interview, anytime you wish, I shall be ready. Thank you.
Well, this is Barçın Yinanç. I'm doing foreign policy talks for Panorama Portal, and stay tuned for the next episode. Goodbye.